Welcome to the podcast. This is the Godward Show. I'm Casey, your host, and we're talking Ralph Waldo Emerson today. This is going to be in the direction of optimism today, a real white pill, but you got to earn it. So hang in there for a few minutes because, first we have to sort of go through hell sometimes in order to make progress. What is this podcast? Why am I doing it? The short answer is I had kids. I guess I could say I got married, and then I had kids. And then in 2016, I fell into this pitiful medical crisis that really sucked. I won't elaborate now, but it was traumatizing. I spent a ton of time off, alone, contemplating, not working for a year, trying to get healthy. I think the combination of these things, like I said, having children, dealing with the crisis, and so on, caused me to reflect on what really matters, in life. And I suppose at this point, that seems pretty understandable to most people, right? And you've all heard of these big questions. But then at the same time, I noticed that the world was changing quite drastically. So many of the things I considered to be normal in the early 1990s were no longer normal or even acceptable. And some of the things that people didn't even talk about in 1990 for fear of embarrassment were now considered totally normal. So just as I was trying to latch on to something that might last, some sort of tradition that might tie me together with both my grandparents on the one hand and my not yet born grandchildren on the other, the world seemed to be chipping away at anything that might try to last for 5 generations. This 5-generation thing, by the way, in case you haven't heard me mention it before, is from Hesiod, but I sort of customized it. It became a goal for me, basically. I learned more about what real people in 1955 believed, and about my own grandparents' beliefs. It wasn't that I needed to do everything exactly as they did, of course. I don't know how they parted their hair, or even what tone of voice they considered to be normal, but on the big questions, I wanted to see if I could have anything in common with them. And then, if I discovered anything in common with my grandparents, I wanted to try to impart a respect for that stuff in my children. And hopefully they'll pass it on to their children to make the 5-generation connection happen. Does that make sense? So, for example, my family has long valued what it called education. But I'm not sure they necessarily meant college or institutional education. This is something that I'm sorting out. I'm having to figure out for myself. I know my grandpa strongly endorsed education, but what I think he meant is learning. My parents encouraged that in me, so I'll try to instill that same thing in my children. And I hope that family tradition will continue to last, at least 2 more generations. And by the way, if it does, then it should be of interest to my future grandchildren. What their great grandparents believed about things. So I'm trying to create a sort of intergenerational time capsule thing. It's like a Venn diagram where you see through the 5 generations what is in common there. Even though it's not perfect, I think my grandpas would have doffed their caps at the name Shakespeare, for instance. In fact, I even own my great-grandpa's complete Shakespeare, as a matter of fact. It's a pretty cool heirloom. And I just received from my mother, my great-great-grandma's Bible, which is pretty cool. It's just got a few little marginalia, but it goes, I think the publication date was 1860 or 61 or something like that. So the goal of this podcast is to be able to say things that my great-grandparents definitely would have understood, or my grandparents, and also that hopefully my grandchildren will be able to understand. Against the ravages of time, I'm clinging to these literary texts as anchors. As T.S. Eliot said at the end of The Wasteland, quote, these fragments I have shored against my ruins. So anyway, that sort of explains why I'm trying to present this content. At least it explains it to me. And I think it explains my POV, which as much as possible is simply what passed for rather common sense in 1955. The classics were respected in a certain way then, and I'm continuing to respect them in that same way now. Ralph Waldo Emerson was important to me, mostly when I was in my 20s, I confess. See, if I were able to design a sort of lifetime curriculum, I would actually start with the ancient classics, the Bible, the pre-Socratics, Gilgamesh, Plutarch, etc. And then only later would I introduce to the student modern writers, among them 19th century Americans. But the way it worked for me is that when I was 20 years old and trying to figure out what I should make of my life, basically the first time I asked the big questions, the most ancient stuff I had been exposed to was Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry David Thoreau. I had a terribly dorky 25-year-old boyish 10th grade English teacher who I just messed with all year, and so he gave me B's, and when the time came, he wouldn't recommend me for AP English 11, which is when they did the ancients, so I missed all that. So I got into 12th grade AP English, but by then they were doing the American stuff. Anyway, the point is, I arrived at Emerson after I had read the New Testament once on my own, and picked up some Nietzsche on my own, but with hardly anything else under my belt. And more than that, I had more or less declared myself an atheist by age 20. So I was 3+ years into that maneuver when I started reading Emerson. And so in one very important respect, Emerson's thinking helped me begin the process of moving past atheism into what I consider to be more interesting, because more sophisticated and more true ways of thinking, where physics is no longer enough, but ultimately metaphysics becomes necessary. You start to realize that like transcendent ideal categories, theology, is sort of a higher science than, philosophy or like, what they called the natural sciences in the 18th century, natural philosophy. Okay, so Emerson himself had probably gone through a similar process. He was an elite in Boston, and his father had been a minister back when Unitarians were still ostensibly Christian. Ralph was into Harvard by age 14, and he was a junior pastor at Boston's Second Church by age 26. So this is around 1829. Then his wife died, and shortly after that he started struggling against the standard procedures and customs of the church. In 1832, he wrote in his journal, quote, "I have sometimes thought that in order to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the ministry." Shortly after that, he published a really interesting essay called The Lord's Supper, which I urge you to read to understand the seed of Emerson's Transcendentalism, in which he argued that the communion ritual was not necessary for salvation. And indeed, its observance may even have become an obstacle to salvation because his parishioners pinned so much of their hopes on what he saw as just, a dry ritual. In his mind, rituals are outward and therefore sort of dead. The key thing, as he understood it, was something inward, a conversion of the soul, of the mind, of the spirit, and so on. In that essay on the Lord's Supper, he remarks, quote, "We ought to be cautious in taking even the best ascertained opinions and practices of the primitive church for our own. If it could be satisfactorily shown that they esteemed it authorized and to be transmitted forever, that does not settle the question for us. We know how inveterately they were attached to their Jewish prejudices, and how often even the influence of Christ failed to enlarge their views." So if you take anything away from that essay, it's the idea that the mind or the soul is the place of the real action, the place that matters most. Emerson is a rationalist, an idealist, not an empiricist. And one principle follows if you're consistent on that point, and that is no institution can capture the inward realities. At best, it can facilitate the inward dynamics that we seek, but it's no substitute for the inward work. In other words, you can go to church just mindlessly And for Emerson, that would be a complete waste of time. Before I move on from this point, don't throw the charge of heresy at him too quickly, at least if you're a Protestant. He's not so far removed from someone like John Calvin, who in fact wrote at the beginning of his very well-known Institutes of the Christian Religion, quote, "Our wisdom, insofar as it ought to be deemed true and solid wisdom, consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But as these are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of the two precedes and gives birth to the other." End quote. That's an amazing thought. This thought that God and the self are inextricably connected, and that uniting them is ultimately the entire point of religion, was not first imagined by Emerson, but he did sort of announce the doctrine to a continent which had first, in its Protestantism, effectively cut itself off from the Catholic mystical tradition, and then second, in its Revolutionary era, cut itself off from even the pious traditions of the New England Puritans. In other words, Emerson reintroduced the idea of God to a people who had grown very, very lukewarm spiritually. If you don't believe me, take a look at Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, or any of Thomas Jefferson's very aloof takes on Christianity. By the way, there's an interesting side note here, which is that it does seem like it is necessary to curb sectarian religious zeal if you want to see political revolution. This is why the Enlightenment sort of caused political revolutions. If you start doubting God and his clergy, well, then you can certainly doubt the authority of the monarch, or, the sovereign. Anyway, if America reached a low point in religious zeal around the time Emerson was born in 1803, he would spend his entire life trying to help Americans rediscover what they had lost, to pump zeal back into the American mind. It seems to me that that is the single driving thought behind almost all of his work, and in that way, he continued as a minister even after his Boston congregation fired him for refusing to administer the sacrament of communion. As he began to deploy a whole new vocabulary and to initiate a line of thought that would come to be called Transcendentalism, he more or less retained the inner essence of Christian thought, if such a thing is possible. Spiritual rebirth, connection to God, etc. This stuff stays, even if it will be labeled differently in Emersonianism. So we're going to drop all the language of, traditional religion, but ultimately not try to betray it. Really, just try to rediscover the original idea that was there before it had been articulated, something like that. So, okay, let's get to 1836, when he publishes his essay Nature. He's 33 years old. Now for the optimism. Emerson begins the essay with a cryptic quote from Plotinus, which is a telling choice. And I'll get to that in just a second. I'll tell you what it says in just a second. And then he begins the essay this way. So he says, "Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies and histories and criticism." This is all backwards stuff, retrospective. "The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs?" End quote. So like any magnum opus, this essay begins with a real clarion call here, a shot across the bow, the whole big thesis all at once. And what's the idea? Basically, all of the ancient gods and religious rituals served their function back then, but they're dried up now, and we are too skeptical, and so we can't hear them anymore. And so we need to tap back into the source directly. Abraham heard the voice of God directly. Why not us then? It's certainly an exciting idea. But I think most of you, if you don't roll your eyes, will immediately ask, okay, but how? The second paragraph in Emerson's Nature is extremely optimistic about our prospects for this. Emerson says, quote, "We must trust the perfection of the creation so far as to believe that whatever curiosity the order of things has awakened in our minds, the order of things can satisfy. Every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic to those inquiries he would put. He acts it as life before he apprehends it as truth. In like manner, nature is already, in its forms and tendencies, describing its own design. Let us interrogate the great apparition that shines so peacefully around us. Let us inquire, to what end is nature?" That's an amazing question, you guys. What is the purpose of all this, right? Emerson is re-enchanting the universe here. The planets, I was just talking to a buddy about this today, like like Newton's physics doesn't have purpose. It's just, it's like God sort of kick-started it, but other than that, it has no connection to God. It's not meaningful. This is new with Newton, right? But so Emerson tries to reintroduce the idea that all things mean something. Okay, so to what end is nature? Well, to see it, we have to learn to decode it. We have to learn to read it in just the same way as he makes mention of the hieroglyphs, right? You have to trust, believe that these things around you, the world, the things that happen, your sensations, even your thoughts, that these things mean something. That's the first step. And then you have to learn to read them. What an amazing sentence or two. First, notice that it does all hinge on trust or faith. We must first trust the order of things or the creation, and then believe that all of our questions can be answered. But there's a pain in this too, he mentions. Emerson says we must first act, and only then can we understand our life, our sensations, the meaning of it all. Okay? All of it is precisely like hieroglyphs. Interesting side note here, the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799 and not really translated until the early 1820s and not really fully translated until the late 1820s. So basically it was topical at the time to use the idea of hieroglyphs, which, of course, look like anyone could walk into the pyramids and see immediately that these symbols must mean something. They aren't arbitrary. There appeared to be a grammar to them, repeated use of certain symbols and so on. But no one knew how to crack it. No one could read what they saw there. This, Emerson says, is how nature works. The epigraph at the beginning of the essay from Plotinus reads, quote, "Nature is but an image or imitation of wisdom, the last thing of the soul, nature being a thing which doth only do, but not know." Just take the first part of that. Nature is but an image or imitation of wisdom. When he says is but, he means like is only. So nature is merely or is only an image or imitation of wisdom. That's an incredible claim. It's a supernatural claim. It's really radical. It's the purest sort of idealism imaginable. The whole material universe becomes like a video game here. Your experiences are clues that will help you level up and see reality. They're symbols. The main work of the priest then should be to articulate new analogies. There was nothing wrong with Jesus's parables. In fact, bravo, Jesus. But we live in different times, Emerson would say, different conditions. Who even uses wineskins anymore? No one knows what a mustard seed looks like. And so we need new analogies. really think about this, especially if you're attached to Jesus's parables or the words of his teachings. The parables are never about what they are about at the superficial level. So that suggests that we might allude to the truth that is being alluded to by his parables with altogether different analogs, right? I mean, when Jesus says no one pours new wine, or what does he say? New wine into new or old wineskins, for if they do, the wineskins will burst and it'll ruin both the wine and the wineskins. It's like, what are you talking about? You know, that's too distant, like as an analogy here. And so this suggests we might allude to the truth that he's trying to get at, which is it has nothing to do with wine or wineskins, right? It's a spiritual truth. And so it suggests that we could allude to that same spiritual truth by way of a different analogy that might be clearer to people in the present. My favorite part of Buddha's Diamond Sutra actually sort of covers the same problem. And I'm going to read you about 3 sentences here. He says, this is at the end of chapter 6 of Buddha's Diamond Sutra, if you're interested, it's really good. It says, when the Buddha explains these things using such concepts and ideas, people should remember the unreality of all such concepts and ideas. They should recall that in teaching spiritual truths, the Buddha always uses these concepts and ideas in the way that a raft is used to cross a river. Once the river has been crossed over, the raft is of no more use and should be discarded. Still Buddha, these arbitrary concepts and ideas about spiritual things need to be explained to us as we seek to attain enlightenment. However, ultimately, these arbitrary conceptions can be discarded. So Emerson would definitely recognize this idea. Everything outward is transitory. What matters is the life of the spirit. He would say the Eucharist is valuable if it does the work on your soul, if it gets you reborn, if it gets you the new eyes. But if some other rite, or even some other sequence of words, produces the same effect, the desired effect, the John chapter 3 born again effect, with equal or greater intensity, then do that instead. Okay? Or to quote another of Buddha's sermons, all things are on fire. So, let go of your cherished analogies and try to find new ones in nature, which always exists around us today. You know, the sun shines today also, he says at the beginning of nature. So you want to taste the magic? You want this inner psychological change or whatever? Okay, so you want this conversion of the senses. Emerson says, so the rest of this essay, Nature, which is about like 50 pages or so, is going to walk you through how to do it, so how to get it, okay? The first section is called Solitude, and I think it's one of the most important. He suggests there that you can't get this magic unless you really, really isolate. And he says you have to be like more alone than just going into your bedroom. You have to also turn off your computer and your phone. He says books, but he would say your computer and your TV and your phone and YouTube if you were here now, because that's not really alone, right? So true isolation. Go out and look at the stars, he suggests. And eventually what happens is something literally supernatural, okay? Emerson says, for example, the greatest delight which the fields and woods minister is the suggestion of an occult relation between man and the vegetable. I am not alone and unacknowledged. They nod to me, and I to them. The waving of the boughs in the storm is new to me and old. It takes me by surprise, and yet is not unknown. Its effect is like that of a higher thought or a better emotion coming over me when I deemed I was thinking justly or doing right. Thoreau, by the way, echoes this in chapter 5 of Waldo. this idea that like the plants themselves, that everything in nature will like befriend you and you will never be lonely again, and you can go anywhere in the world and be at home after this conversion experience, after you learn how to read, literally like read nature, which right now you look out there and you just go, oh yeah, I just see the trees and the grass and the birds. I mean, right? But for Emerson, no, it's like all things have a purpose. Everything is suggesting something to you. This is like, this is a mega thought. I mean, it almost can't be true, but if it is true, it changes everything. I have this in my hands. I have this. Can you see this? This is a Petoskey stone from northern Michigan, in Lake Michigan, and it has to be polished up like that. But once you polish it up, you can see it's a fossilized coral, and so it has those hexagrammatic shapes in there, and it's really amazing. The surface is super glassy smooth, you know. And for Emerson, I mean, this is like a diamond. Like, there is some meaning in this. You've got to look at it until you understand. You have to understand. Like, I would have to show you one of my unpolished Petoskey stones, and then see the process, the work that has to go into before to bring out its inner essence. Right? For Emerson, this is an analog for the soul. Very obviously, he would call it self-culture. You're going to work on yourself until the true you begins to emerge. Okay, whatever. Beyond this, whoa, hold on. Sorry. Oh no, that's going to be really loud in your ears. Really loud. Sorry. We're not starting over though. Just buck up there. My microphone stand, my tripod on the microphone is pretty iffy. So we'll go like that. Boom. Okay, enough gesticulating. So beyond this, Emerson writes an interesting chapter on beauty. I think it's chapter 3 or 4 in Nature. Capital B, beauty. You know, it's one of my favorite topics. It used to make students really uncomfortable. There were two words that freaked people out, and one was beauty with a capital B. Unless they thought you were talking about, like, you know, the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine, they were cool with it there. But as soon as you talked about like true capital B beauty of the kind you see in a Florence cathedral or something, then they were like, I don't get it. I don't know, you know. The other one was sin, by the way. Both of these are like devastating words for the uninitiated somehow still. Anyway, beyond, so he writes this chapter on beauty where he suggests, quote, the world thus exists to the soul to satisfy the desire of beauty. Now that's kind of circular, but this satisfying sense, he says, is not ultimate. Ultimately, he says, quote, natural, like physical beauty is the herald of inward and eternal beauty. So that's amazing. That's the, you know, physiognomy is real meme. It's like, it's, you know, outward beauty is but a indicator that true inward, transcendent, eternal beauty is real, right? And so again, we have to like level up. You have to transcend to understand this thought. Our destiny for Emerson is like in the Platonic forms, not in anything physical. Now you have to read like one whole essay by Emerson to sort of see how these things all tie together. And I recommend Nature as the first one. I mean, that is his sort of his foundation piece, I guess. But what happens if you keep reading Emerson, and you might, I mean, he's sort of an addicting writer. Like, he gives the spirit in some sense. I always feel better reading him. That's why I'm feeling optimistic. It was a good thing to read on the New Year. I read him yesterday. And I feel like, yeah, I mean, man, everything does mean anything. Nihilism is for idiots. You know, all you have to do is interpret, and then the world signifies. So that's part of it. I mean, basically, like, we are here in the same way as we are placed in classrooms. It's just that many of us haven't even begun to get what's going on here. We're not even listening to the lecture yet, you know. But once you start to do that, the world will suggest things to you. In fact, this is the direction that leads to like the synchronicities that Carl Jung would write about. And by the way, it's also potentially dangerous. Like there is the possibility that you can sort of interpret too much as meaningful. And if you do that, you just end up like Captain Ahab. This is probably the birth of like the manic mindset, where now it's not just odd that the whale who bit your leg off was also white, but that must mean something. And now like the whole cosmos starts to revolve around you, and it's like every little thing that happens is suffused with, like, you're on the battlefield of good and evil constantly. I mean, I honestly, like, I would love to know somebody who's living like this. It's sort of awesome actually, but like if you do it too much, people will just be like, yo, you're freaking me out. And so you got to be able to kind of go back and forth, I suppose, at least if you want to keep one foot in, society. Anyway, so like I said, there's, if you keep reading Emerson, eventually you start to see that there's only one major idea in Emerson. And it's this idea I'm trying to describe, which is all things are interconnected and you're a part of it and you can know it and merge with it and have the holy experience and so on. And really in his writing, he just keeps repeating this over and over and over again in 100 different interesting ways until you get it. Now, I mean, of course, some of his later writing, he talks about other stuff. I mean, it's interesting that Emerson was very late on most of the political stuff. I mean, they tried to drag him in early to the anti-slavery movement, for example, and Emerson was kind of like, I don't know, not my thing, exactly. And so I don't know if that's a weakness of this or if that's sort of interesting. Like sometimes I feel like, yeah, politics is necessary, but then sometimes I also feel like, too much politics will kind of soil your soul if you really get attached to things like that. Anyway, so of the one big idea, where does this thing come from? Well, okay, I don't think Emerson made it up out of thin air. If anything, it's kind of the perennialist idea. But specifically, it began in his time with the German hieroglyphism in Bible theology, which played quite a large role, first in Germany, obviously, and then shortly after in America. There's a really interesting story to this, actually. Like when the German hieroglyphism got to like Harvard, the people at Harvard had this interesting debate about the nature of authority. Like, where does authority come from? Do we believe Jesus? As a teacher, do we believe Jesus? Would you have followed Jesus? Would you have gone out to get baptized by John the Baptist? In fact, Jesus asked this question. Where does John's authority to baptize come from? And the Pharisees can't answer it, right? So where does authority come from? And there's one school of thought that says, well, basically Jesus established his authority when he did these miracles. It's like after you turn water into wine, if you come to my house and turn water into wine, I'm going to listen to your teachings, right? You have a certain kind of authority if you can turn a rod into a snake or whatever. But there was another school of thought, and this was the German higher critics, who started to they wanted to do the Thomas Jefferson thing. Like, basically, we're going to strip out all the miracles because we don't see any miracles. We're empiricists. We look around the world. There are no miracles. These must be remnants of a mythological way of thinking. Basically, let's get rid of them. Do what Thomas Jefferson did, X-Acto knife them right out of the Bible. And then just retain, like, the moral teachings, basically. But when you do that, the question comes up, well, why should we listen to these? Who cares what these moral teachings say? I mean, are they any more profound than what Schopenhauer is saying or what Kierkegaard is saying, or you know what I mean? Or Kant? And so the answer to that, given by the German higher critics, was that, like, and some of the Americans after them, like Ellery Channing and stuff, was that authority is this kind of intrinsic thing that can be recognized one spirit to another. If you really want to do the deep dive on this, there's a 1740 essay by Jonathan Edwards called something like A Divine and Supernatural Light. and it's an awesome essay. Like, he talks about the idea of like how one spirit recognizes another, and for him it's direct. It's like getting the Philip K. Dick pink beam in your forehead, and there is no mediating, no like outward, um, no miracle. It doesn't matter. There's none of that stuff. You don't have to wear a clerical robe or whatever. You'll just know it. When you see a person whose face is lit up and their eyeballs are clear and their words come with gravity, that's the one, right? That's the authority. So anyway, this was one of the debates that followed on the question of like the German higher criticism stuff. And you can see how this makes so much sense in relation to like the democratizing politics of the era, where like for centuries before this it had been clergy and the monarchs who had been the authority figures, and there had been that whole hierarchy thing. Well, once you're Thomas Paine and you start to question this and like you just pull the rug out from all the authority, it leaves you with, it sort of begs the question, well then, is there authority on earth? Like, how do we know anything is worth listening to? Okay, so that might be one strain of influence on Emerson. Another would be Emanuel Swedenborg's like Hermetic mysticism. I've tried reading some of Swedenborg. It's pretty out there. Maybe, I don't know if I was getting a bad translation or something, but I don't know. I've seen people say that Swedenborg had like a 200 IQ, so it may be that I just couldn't understand him or something like that. But that could be part of, I mean, Emerson cites him. He had this whole doctrine of like correspondence, which is similar to the, as above, so below thinking, right? It's nature. It's the same thing that Emerson is saying, that the things that we see in the world correspond to higher truths, which we would call now like either psychological or spiritual truths. And then, by the way, there was a third parallel or like influence here, which might have been the early translations of thinking from the East, like Confucius and the Hindu Vedas, stuff like that. Although I think Emerson didn't really receive these until maybe the 1840s. I can imagine his thrill upon discovering that they were saying sort of the same thing he's saying in, the what's the Chandogya Upanishad 2,000 years ago. But I don't think he ripped it off from there. I think he arrived at this thought in like a, discovery sort of a way, like he earned it. He found his way there himself, which is interesting because it does suggest perennial truths that anyone who gets down to business can discover for themselves. Let's see. Back to that question of Abraham and like Jesus and authority. I mean, I don't know. I think I've been thinking a lot lately about the need for hierarchy. It really is interesting to think about like a priest caste. And especially, like, it's easy to imagine a way where you could generate a kind of priest caste in one generation. It's basically just peak charisma. Just find some David Koresh guy. He's super smart. He's pretty good looking. He can speak fluently. He knows his Bible or whatever. You know what I mean? He knows his sources. And this is your guy. You just follow him. But there is this question of like, okay, well, whatever institution he sets up, how do you create a priest class that meaningfully succeeds from one generation to the next without losing the thread or without like losing its authority? That's harder to construct, I think. I mean, of course, the ancient Jewish way to do it was by birth. It was just like from one father to son to father to son. And so you get like the Levitical priesthood, and that's one way to do it. But of course, we've all seen sons of woke, lit, authoritative fathers who end up being complete turds. And it's kind of like, well, that's almost, it just obviously seems to refute itself, this idea of like succession by way of the flesh. And so instead you think like the New Testament, like, Romans 4 or Hebrews 7 and 8, the stuff about Melchizedek, like basically we're going to recognize our priests not by flesh, but by the Spirit, like by the immediate voice, I guess, that Jonathan Edwards is talking about, by something inward, not by flesh, but by faith. But it's like, well, what does that look like? Then it becomes very difficult to like police or to like validate. You know what I mean? Like the case of Anne Hutchinson is interesting here. Anne Hutchinson, that 17th century Puritan who kind of said that she had a direct revelation from God akin to Abraham's. And when they questioned her about it, they said, well, how do you know it was the voice of God speaking to you and not some demon? And she said, how did Abraham know? And they were like, are you saying you're like Abraham? And she was like, yes. You know, and I mean, it just kind of short circuits the whole thing. It's like, okay, I guess if you say so. I mean, we're not going to believe you. And at that point, they just kick her out of the colony or something. So, you know, this isn't an easy problem to solve. But if you're not going by like some sort of birth order monarchy or priesthood, you have to try to identify like the true priests by something else. And I suggest that it may not look orthodox. It may not be dressed up in a beard and the clerical robes or, you know, the purple. It may not be wearing a crown. It may look more like a baby born apparently illegitimately to a woman who couldn't find a place to stay and, you know, spending its first night in a manger or something. Like, that's the suggestion here, not, you know, the Orthodox priesthood, right? We're talking new wine, gang. New vessels. Do you understand? That's the idea with Ralph Waldo Emerson. I think my next episode is actually going to be on a story by Nathaniel Hawthorne called The Minister's Black Veil, only because I've been wanting to talk about the masks and COVID stuff lately, and so I'm just going to go ahead and do it in the next episode, but I may circle back to Emerson. I could do an episode on like his essay Circles. I could do one on self-reliance. I also, at some point, I feel like I want to do one on his series of essays called English Traits, which is about the inherited characteristics of the English race, which sounds kind of like awesomely controversial and interesting to me these days. Last thing to note, I'll put the Patreon link in the description under this video. We had another rousing private discussion, which we do twice a month for patrons only. And I mean, you don't have to do this, but I thought we were going to have fun with the board that you can sign up for if you're a patron. So I'll put the link to that here too. Or actually, I'll just send out a reminder link to the patrons only on Patreon for that. But it's a good place to discuss kind of anything you're thinking of these days. Like, don't make me do all the work, for crying out loud. Like, I'm out of academia. I don't want to have to do the thing where I'm like bothering my students all the time. Do the right thing. You guys should be thinking with me, and don't make me do all the lecturing. But yeah, like if you want me to read something, you know, manageable, send me a link and I'll take it on and maybe do a whole, like either drop a chunk into a video or maybe do a whole video on it if it's something I'm sort of confident about or familiar with. Okay, everybody, Happy New Year. Good luck with your resolutions. Here's the outro music, and I'll see you next time.